Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York invites you to be the informed patient with the podcast that features experts from Central New York's only academic medical center. I'm your host, Amber Smith. Among society's foremost problems are aggression and violence. Psychotherapists grapple with the best ways to treat people's inhumanity to one another. A trio of upstate researchers have authored a paper on this subject for the journal Frontiers in Public Health. I'm talking about this research with lead author Dr. Joseph Strayhorn. He's a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Upstate. Welcome to The Informed Patient, Dr. Strayhorn.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
How big of a problem is aggressive behavior?
Well, I would argue, and I think lots of other people would argue too, that it is the fundamental problem for society. We now have enough nuclear bombs to destroy society altogether through aggression. But short of that, being in psychiatry, there is hardly any psychiatric problem that isn't accentuated by the fear of aggression. For example, child abuse, a prevalent form of aggression. We find that there is no psychiatric diagnosis that is not increased in frequency by a history of child abuse. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very common psychiatric problem. The stresses that cause the worst PTSD are those by interpersonal trauma, the cruelty that people do to one another. Psychiatric illnesses, just the general level of fear in society. But a Gallup poll recently found that about 40% of people were afraid of walking alone in some region within a mile of their house because of the fear of aggression from their fellow human beings. So to say that it is a big problem is an understatement.
Is there a definition or a diagnosis for aggressive behavior?
With regard to the issue of diagnosis, one day when I had some time on my hands, I went page by page through the DSM-5, the list of psychiatric disorders, and looked at the criteria for which ones of these diagnoses had aggression, irritability, violence as part of the syndrome, as an associated feature or a central feature of the syndrome. And I counted up to a grand total of 52 of them, so that you can have aggression as a feature of conduct disorder, of bipolar disorder, of borderline personality disorder, of anxiety disorders. Irritability is one of the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. The drug abuse disorders almost all mention the possibility of aggression. So the one that is sort of the quintessential aggression diagnosis is intermittent explosive disorder, which is defined as a pattern of impulsive aggression that happens repeatedly.
The intermittent explosive disorder, do you see that more in men or women?
Well, with regard to all forms of aggression, men outnumber women greatly. And this is probably biologically based. There is probably something in testosterone that facilitates fighting. The phrase roid rage has been applied to bodybuilders who take steroids and seem to get anger control problems from that. But the male-female difference, though it is present in every culture that I've ever seen the statistics on. It isn't the whole story. For example, females in the US have a higher homicide rate than males in Singapore. And there are lots of cultural factors that have to do with rates of aggression rather than just the biological factor of male versus female. One of the researchers has recently found that the combination of poverty and income inequality is a particularly strong predictor of the amount of violence that goes on in a particular society. The rate of alcohol use is very much associated with aggression, and unsurprisingly, the rate of possession of firearms is associated with firearm violence. There are good numbers of factors other than the male-female difference that account for differences in rates of aggression.
What about age? How young do you see aggression showing up in people?
Well, in terms of minor aggression, like just hitting people, this appears to be very frequent in children under 2 years old. And as they develop their brains and get to be school age, that sort of impulsive hitting seems to become less frequent. But in terms of serious violence, there's a strong relationship to age where the age range from 15 to 29, as a bunch of research studies have sort of looked at that segment, that is the peak time for aggression and serious violence and for homicide. In that group, worldwide, homicide is the number 2 cause of death, with accidents being the number 1 cause. It's both of which really can be considered psychological causes of death. As you get older and older, the rate of violence tends to go down. This may have to do with the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is involved in making rational decisions, that in the mid-20s, plus or minus some unknown amount, the prefrontal cortex is thought to finally mature. And in the ages up until then, people have the power to be very violent without having the judgment on the average that tells them, wait, there's a better way to get needs met.
This is Upstate's The Informed Patient podcast. I'm your host, Amber Smith. I'm talking with psychiatrist Joseph Strayhorn from Upstate's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Do we know what causes a person to be aggressive? Is it biological or environmental?
The question is not or, but and. You know, there is definitely a biological component, various biological influences. For example, some specific genes have been discovered that seem to predispose to severe aggression. Interestingly, though, researchers have found that those tend to express themselves when combined with environmental factors such as exposure to violence, such as poverty and deprivation, and other environmental factors, so that there is an interaction between environment, learning, and biology. Another biological factor is lead toxicity. It's a scandal that still in this country, we have kids that are having levels of lead that are damaging to their ability to have these sort of executive functioning that gives alternatives to violent behavior. But the learned factors are very important. The models that you see, what you get reinforced for. People have studied the fact that in children, sometimes the initial expression of aggressive behavior is defensive, that it's meant to fight off other kids that are wanting to victimize them. But then when they get reinforced for success at that, they start becoming the victimizers of other kids. The question of what causes violence and aggression, if you turn me loose on that, we could be talking all day. So I'll move on.
Well, I wanted to ask you in general how aggressive behavior is treated by mental health professionals.
Well, let me first mention how it should not be treated. But one of the unfortunate leftovers from some of the early psychoanalytic thought is that aggression is a drive that builds up and that you need to release it. And what is the primary healing factor is appropriate means of releasing the aggressive drive. This has been known as the catharsis hypothesis. One of the major accomplishments of the second half of the 20th century was the disproving of the catharsis hypothesis, the finding that when you get people to talk out their anger, they tend to be more angry after having done so than when they've done something unrelated. When you get them to punch a punching bag or pound on a pillow, that tends to make them more angry, not less angry. And yet the notion that you get your anger out is still a prevalent idea. It has been a justification for violent video games, violent sports. The data from those are that those worsen the problem, they don't make it better. So what not to do to treat aggression is to try to figure out ways to get rid of it, and get it out of your system as though you were eliminating your bodily waste. How do you treat aggression? In terms of the psychotherapy of aggression, the central helpful thing to do is to teach people alternatives to aggressive behavior, such as rational conflict resolution, appropriate assertive behavior, and let the person practice those alternatives repeatedly so that the alternatives become able to compete in habit strength with the habit of flying off the handle. But this takes a lot of practice because aggressive habits can be rather deeply ingrained, and it isn't just 3 or 4 practices that overcome the habit of lashing out. There are bunches of medication studies having to do with aggression. Some of them have been found helpful. I think, though, that the future for the aggression problem has to do with teaching people alternatives and getting those thoroughly into the repertoire, ideally before the aggression problem comes to fore. In other words, an ounce of prevention is worth many pounds of cure, probably in this area.
Can you describe the work you did analyzing data about people with intermittent explosive disorder for the paper that you wrote?
Yes. Well, we accessed a database called TriNetX, where we had access to the medical records. One of the benefits of the electronic health record is that researchers can access thousands of medical records and answer questions based on the data that is stored therein. And so we found about 32,000 people with diagnoses of intermittent explosive disorder, which is the disorder where you have to have aggression. And we looked at how much psychotherapy do these people get. We didn't have data on how well it worked or what else was tried. We just looked at how many times did they come for a psychotherapeutic session. And we found that for 75% of them, for 3/4 of them, the answer was 0. This is fairly severe aggression to get the diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder, yet 0 psychotherapeutic work done on it. If you look at the next most frequent number of sessions, it's 1, and the next most frequent is 2, and they go down steeply, so that only about 10% of the folks in our sample attended like 9 or 10 sessions or more. About 7.5% attended 14 sessions. And yet that 7.5% absorbed 80% of the psychotherapeutic labor. So we're spending lots and lots of psychotherapeutic time on a small fraction of the aggressive people who are willing and able to get in to participate in psychotherapy. And, this brings up the question of how much psychotherapy is necessary for the undoing of a bad habit of impulsive aggression. And the answer to that is, unfortunately, it depends. It depends on, if you take people who voluntarily sign up for, I need to control my temper better, and I realize that, and I'm willing to drive in for sessions to see how much I can help myself, and we're going to measure the outcome by how much I think I've been helped, then the answer is maybe 12 sessions can get a statistically significant result. If, however, you look at people who have gotten into the justice system because of aggressive behavior and give them a 45-hour intervention, you can find an approximately 0 effect size on their recidivism rate. So how much it takes depends on how deeply the habit is ingrained and how intensely the aggressive problem is manifesting itself. What we found in this study was that the number of people who are receiving what we would think of as a requisite amount of time to undo the habit of impulsive aggression is, by any standard, a small fraction of the people who are getting the diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder.
I want to have you clarify the data set that you were working with all of these
Mhm.
people. Their names and identifying information is not part of that for the researchers, right?
That's right. All the identifying data is very carefully combed out so that all we see are numbers to crunch.
So if so few of the aggressive people are taking part in enough therapy to make a difference, do you have ideas for how to reach those who could really benefit from longer term therapy?
Uh, my own feeling is that since prevention is better than cure, and since this probably takes a good number of hours, and for a lot of people, it may take hundreds of hours. The one place where that amount of hours of psychoeducational work, of training, practice, the place where that is most abundantly available is in schools. And there have been promising studies with uh, training of children in kindness, conflict resolution, anti-bullying strategies, anti-aggression uh, strategies in schools, but we are in the infancy on those. I have been researching individual tutoring of children and teaching them anger control strategies as a component of an individual tutoring program, which involves partly taking bunches and bunches of hypothetical provocations and letting them practice, among other things, generating a bunch of nonviolent options of what to do in that hypothetical situation. So as to develop from a fairly early age the reflex of here's a provocation. I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. What are the pros and cons? What's the best thing that I can do? If we can develop that reflex in people from a very early age, I think that will probably be the most important method for reducing violence in society. But we're a long way from that. I mean, our schools are not even all that successful at teaching people to read, much less the more difficult goal of teaching them to get along with each other in harmony.
You're listening to Upstate's The Informed Patient podcast. I'm your host, Amber Smith. My guest is psychiatrist Joseph Strayhorn from Upstate's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Violence or aggressive behavior often turns out to be criminal and people end up in prison. Is our prison system in America doing anything, or is it doing enough to reduce aggression?
Well, the purposes of imprisonment are thought to be several, one of which is just to remove the person from the opportunity to commit further violence. Another purpose of it in the minds of many people is retribution or revenge, which in my opinion is a somewhat irrational motive. Another motive is deterrence that, is sort of linked to that the worse experience prison is, the more likely people are to avoid it. Evidence for that as a very effective means of preventing violence is not very strong. But the other justification for uh, imprisonment is rehabilitation. And I think from what I know of the prison system, that goal is not being accomplished well at all. In fact, there are data suggesting that just the opposite happens, that people learn methods of criminality from each other. They victimize one another, which gives them more of a tendency to be violent and aggressive. And the rehabilitation function does not seem to be working well. If I had my way, society would abandon the idea that we want prison to just be so unpleasant that people will be scared of it, and devote ourselves more wholeheartedly to the question of how do we teach people these nonviolent skills, these conflict resolution skills, and really get down to business on that, which I don't see us as having done yet.
I'd like to ask you about the effects of violence or the threat of violence on the people who are around the person who is aggressive. What are their lives like?
The ill effects of violence are contagious. Violence itself is contagious, that when people are the recipients of aggression, they tend to be aggressive back. But they also tend to have more anxiety, which is rational because you're scared of getting hurt. They tend to be more depressed because they're just unhappy at living in an environment where they can be hurt or attacked or verbally demeaned. They tend to even biological disorders that are taken as pretty strongly determined by genetic factors like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. There's very strong research showing that people with these disorders who are in family emotional climates where there's lots of criticism and hostility, that their prognoses are much worse than those who are in a more positive emotional climate. Children who are in negative emotional climates tend to have all these disorders more frequently. They tend to be more aggressive themselves. The effects are certainly not limited to the person himself or herself, really by definition, with aggression.
We've been talking mostly about individual hostilities, but it makes me wonder whether some of this would apply to governments that go to war against one another. Those are acts of aggression. Would any of these techniques help to bring peace?
There, is a big academic field of study about conflict resolution tactics as applied to international relations. And the problem, of course, is you get powerful leaders and they are capable of disregarding that very large body of work anytime they want to, and never exposing themselves to it at all. But there is a tremendous amount of thought and effort that has been put into the application of the basic conflict resolution paradigm, which is that both parties communicate what they need, what their interests are, rather than insulting the other party, is sort of the first step. And both parties trying to understand what the positions and the interests are of the other, and demonstrating that they do understand, and then generating possible plans, not just one, but several different possibilities, and then looking at the predicted consequences, the advantages and disadvantages of those possibilities, and making a choice based on the pros and cons with respect to the welfare of both parties. This basic conflict resolution paradigm should apply to nations as well as to individuals. Of course, there are bunches of barriers to that, including that sometimes the citizenry of the country do not want a rational, nonviolent solution. I think of Gandhi, Anwar Sadat, Martin Luther King, who, are peacemakers par excellence, and each of them were assassinated. So there needs to be some public support for nonviolent solutions. Nonetheless, there have been people who have worked in the psychological realm with individuals who have applied their work to disputes between nations. Marshall Rosenberg, who wrote a book entitled Nonviolent Communication, has worked with, for example, disputes between countries in Africa with some success at times. So it is an area that is fruitful. There's a whole field of dispute resolution known as law. And there, why is it that that Tennessee and Kentucky don't go to war with each other when they have a dispute with each other, or Arizona and California over water rights or something like that? It's because there are courts to settle it. And one of the major strategies is international courts or international dispute resolution methods that can work in the same way that court systems work within a country. But this so far is mainly aspirational rather than reality, although there has been some progress in that direction.
Well, this is very interesting work. I appreciate you taking time to tell us about it.
Well, it has been my pleasure.
My guest has been Dr. Joseph Strayhorn, a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Upstate. The Informed Patient is a podcast covering health, science, and medicine, brought to you by Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York, and produced by Jim Howe, with sound engineering by Bill Brokel and graphic design by Dan Cameron. Find our archive of previous episodes at upstate.edu/informed. If you enjoyed this episode, please invite a friend to listen. You can also rate and review the Informed Patient podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. This is your host, Amber Smith, thanking you for listening.